apologies. But I'm sure you all listened very well last lecture. So now what we established is the outer hair cells have a motor protein, and once the potassium flows in, they compress. This is the result. This is what Bekeshi measured. This is here called response during drug treatment without the motor proteins, but you can also say this is the dead cochlea. This is the linear, the passive cochlea. Linear means it would actually be linear in terms of there's no compression, there is no frequency interaction, there's no tone going down if you're deaf. If you have normal hearing, it is non-linear. You have the massive increase, 100-fold increase in amplitude because of the outer hair cells. Okay, now there are three types of cochlear non-linearity that are worth mentioning. One is in terms of amplitude, that is non-linear amplification. One is in terms of frequency, this is called combination tones, and we had a demonstration of that already. And the third one is compression, it's actually also amplitude, but it means a reduction of dynamic range, which we talk in a second. Right, this is as a reminder, last lecture, we have the basilar membrane here unrolled from the base to the apex. We have the passive, the linear envelope of the dynamic of the traveling wave, and when we put energy in, we would get this healthy living response pattern. Okay, this gives us 40 decibel amplification, factor of 100, and this is actually measured. This is from a guinea pig, basilar membrane tuning curves, measured at one site, namely at this site here, at 10 kilohertz. That's where we can relatively easy get to. And it measures at different amplitudes, this is in different colors, and in different frequencies, the response at this place. And we plot we plot the gain, which is the ratio of response between one and the other. So you see this is a logarithmic axis, and we can get quite high gains in Pascal, per Pascal, nanometer per Pascal, that is. Okay, green one is very loud sound. You see that you get response from all frequencies. At 10 kilohertz, you get all the frequencies, 3 kilohertz, 4 kilohertz, 5 kilohertz. They all will result in some response at this place. If you go to lower amplitudes, higher attenuations, you get a steeper and steeper curve. Now remember here, this is not absolute measure, this is a relative measure. So it doesn't mean that at 20 decibel you get higher amplitude, it just means you get a higher gain, which is a higher amplification from something which starts much lower. So there are two ways of plotting that. You can either plot absolute values or you plot gain. But most of the time we're actually interested in gain, and you see that for the gain, the higher the amplitude, the broader the response. So, at which amplitudes are you best at frequency selectivity? Are you better at 20 decibel or better at 80 decibel? 80. How do you justify that from this figure? Yeah, but that's actually a bad thing, believe it or not. Because if you have response across the basilar membrane, you're not able to separate them from each other. They're all being in a big mush, in a big mixture of sounds. What you want is to have the response in a narrow filter, so that you have very many different filters. What you want is an actual response like that, the low one, the low amplitudes. Narrow filter, sharp filters, because the sharp filters allow you to filter sharp frequencies. Yes, narrow band frequencies. Well, it depends on the stimulus, obviously. Here it's just a pure tone, but if you talk about a wide frequency stimulus like my voice, then you have a lot of narrow band frequencies that are then split into narrow band filters. Now, you notice more and more, we talk more and more about perception here, and this is why it is so important to back all of that up with perception. You're going to do your own experiments on frequency and amplitude discrimination to see that what we're talking about here on the physiology is actually true psychologically, psychophysically. Okay, and here comes the most fun bit, namely the compression. I guess that we'll talk about that on Friday again, but I challenge you to understand that here as much as possible, and maybe go to a book like the Brian Moore's book and read a few pages on that by Friday as well. So let's try to understand this figure here. We have an input level on the x-axis, and we have the response in dB on the y-axis. The input level in dB is the actual sound pressure that we put in. Let's say at a specific frequency, you face 1000 Hertz, and we observe the response at the place of the maximum excitation, which is also on 1000 Hertz, and we plot the response in dB, which is a gain again. Yeah, dB, if we measure something in dB, it's always a relative measure. It's not an absolute measure, it's a relative measure. Oh yeah, trick question, what is the input level relative to? Who listened on Friday? Come on. Yeah? 2? Throw a number at me. What is it relative to? I was just asking a trick question. I say everything that is measured in dB is not an absolute measure. You might think that amplitude is absolute, but it's not. It's relative. It's relative to something. Relative to? To 0 dB. Correct. And what is 0 dB? No, it's not. It depends. It depends on nothing. It's a very firm definition of what that is in pascals. 2 times 10, 20 micropascals. Yeah. So dB here is relative to 20 micropascals. The output is relative to, I don't actually know exactly, to the output, relative to the output at 0, I suppose, in dB. But this doesn't have to be, this is not a dB sound pressure, this is probably a dB a movement. Yeah? You can have a dB for anything. We usually use it for sound, but it just means 1 divided by the other and take the logarithm. Okay. Now, let's look at this horizontal, this linear function here first. That is, linear growth is the function of a dead basilar membrane. Yeah? If you put in 50 decibel, you observe 50 decibel output. If you put in 60, observe 60, 80, 80, and if you put in 100, you get out 100. And we usually stop at 80 for ethical risk assessment reasons. Okay? So that's boring. That would be linear. But that's not what we perceive. What we perceive is something very much different, namely much broader range. We don't start listening at 50. We start listening at 0, roughly. And at 0, our basilar membrane amplifies for us up to, I said 40 to 50 decibel earlier. Here it is 55 decibel to the actual hearing threshold. So here we're at 0 dB, it crosses the response threshold, and this difference, this distance, is what the outer hair cells give us. That's the amplification. Okay? So here 50 decibel to the left, it pushes up the hearing threshold to 0. Okay. And then what happens if you have a quiet sound? It grows, the response. It grows, it grows, it grows, up to a point where it still grows, but much, much slower. And then it's slow, 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 but still linear in a certain range, namely 20, what is it, 30 to 60 decibel. And then it grows still up to where it meets our linear curve at about 100. Okay? Why does it meet our curve at 100? Because at some stage, 100 I think is quite optimistic for that. It doesn't matter. At 100 decibel, it is so loud, the sound, that you don't need to amplify it anymore. The amplification is only really necessary at quieter sounds. Yeah? Especially at the very quiet sounds between 0 and 50 decibel. Now, compression is the fact that this curve captures 100 decibel on a scale between here 55 and 100, so 45 decibel. So you compress 100 decibel into 45 decibel. Yeah? Why do you want to do that? A number of reasons for that. First of all, you expand. There's an expansion and a compression. Expansion means you actually hear at lower amplitudes. And secondly, you compress it to much lower dynamic range. That's what's called the dynamic range. The reason for that is because all the nerve fibers later on are not capable of coding, of actually representing 100 decibels. They only can represent something like 30 to 40 decibels. And that's why we need to compress the whole input to a much, much smaller response range. I put a figure down here, the wide dynamic range compression, to illustrate that this is pretty much what a hearing aid does. A hearing aid, let's assume we have a severe hearing loss, which means effectively all the outer hair cells are dead. We only have inner hair cells left. We only have a linear frequency, linear growth, like that, like this, and we make the output louder, so 0 dB, we amplify up to 40, and then we follow roughly this curve. So the hearing aid does exactly what the outer hair cells were doing in the cochlea. Because the outer hair cells don't work for a hearing impaired person, the hearing aid substitutes that in the same way. And we describe that with either a linear function, or quite often we have a knee point in there somewhere, and then we have a bilinear function, which is two linear functions, which then simulate the function that we want. Here, this is probably best fitted with two knee points, one here, so we've got a linear from there to there, a linear from there to there, a linear from there to there, with three different slopes. Okay. Right. Auditory filters and hearing loss. How do that I'd already said something about that, but how does it actually connect to each other? As I said, this is the response curve of the basilar membrane, so the displacement in blue is the dead one, or the damaged one. In red is the one plus the hair cells. So this is plus outer hair cells, this blue one is minus the outer hair cells. The inner hair cells for the time being are completely unaffected. All the hearing loss, the sensory neural hearing loss that we're talking about, is mostly a factor of the outer hair cells. Okay, the thing that I want to put a picture on is that we can imagine flipping this movement over, this basilar membrane movement. So here, in the original one, we plot that as a basilar membrane displacement, and in the next one, we place that we call that sensitivity in decibel, which is, for example, the threshold. And this is a reasonable thing to do in many cases. And if you think about it like that, we now get tuning curves. They're now called tuning curves, which gives you the frequency properties. So this is a filter in the way that we understand filters, and we know that the blue curves is a very broad filter, and the red curve is a much narrower filter, which has a much lower threshold. Okay. Summarizing benefits of nonlinearity, so the outer hair cells that bring in all the nonlinearities. The amplification allows a better signal-to-noise ratio for very quiet sounds. So we enhance the sounds. Selectivity, so we need a better selectivity, then we can selectively enhance the sounds and not the noise. That gives us a better signal-to-noise ratio. The compression enables the coding and therefore the perception of a much broader amplitude range. And the amplification allows a better frequency resolution, because the filter becomes narrower. So these are the nonlinear effects that we're talking about. If we lose these nonlinearities, how do we lose them? I said a number of times, by losing outer hair cells. Why do we lose outer hair cells? because their stereocilia are embedded in the tectorial membrane, so if you have very loud sounds, it becomes detached often. Sometimes they can't repair. I should talk about that a little bit more actually. There are interesting processes going on. Sometimes they can repair, but if they're too much damaged, they cannot repair, and then the stereocilia rip out physically, and the cell can't regenerate that, and then the hair cell dies. And the problem with outer hair cells, or inner hair cells for that matter, is they can't regenerate. That's where the genetic treatments come in that are developed. I have read a paper a few weeks ago that they have actually trialed genetic treatment on a mice, and they have restored some of the stereocilia and in the outer hair cells. And this is the way to go in future, obviously. If we can restore the outer hair cell function, we can actually restore hearing. We don't need hearing aids anymore. That will probably take 20 years, but then I said 10 years ago already that will still take 20 years, so in 20 years I might still say it takes 20 years. Who knows? That's not our business. So, that leads to loss of outer hair cells. That is the main effect, well, one of the main effects of presbyocusis. It can be as a function of ototoxic drugs. Ototoxic drugs can kill hair cells, or noise-induced hearing loss. These are the three main factors. Noise-induced hearing loss, there's just one slide here that I want to put up, which is not necessarily from audiology, but from, you should know about that. That's the recommended doses, or actually not recommended, the allowable weekly sound exposure to be safe with unprotected ears. And this is a very curious time interval axis, here from 1 second up to 40 hours. And this is dBA, so this is a slightly filtered, high-pass filtered frequency range from 80 to 140, so that's really loud. So, in other words, you can be exposed for 40 hours to 85 decibels. That's fine. That's the level of an iPhone if you're not turning it on too much. 5 hours for 95 decibels, or 1 hour for 100 decibels. It says here major sporting event. It's quite loud. 100 decibel for me is already painful. Then it starts in minutes. Loud bar with band, 100 decibels, up to 1 minute of an old chainsaw, which is around 120 decibels. So safe means don't put that too much a fine point on it, but this is the legal limit. The problem is, if you go over that, you have, well, if you're an employer, you have responsibilities. And the responsibilities are to protect your employees from noise exposure, especially here in the red area. Here the red dotted line is risk for any period of time, because it's in the matter of seconds. So 125 is a threshold, almost threshold of pain. And we say 1 second, 135 decibel, but don't try it. You don't get an ethics application, a risk assessment through for that in the ISPR. So why is that important? Because hearing loss, noise-induced hearing loss, is the single biggest insurance claim factor in the world now. It has changed over the last 10 years, 20 years. The reason being that in the 70s and in the 80s, when the UK still had some industry going, this was all big machine industry, car building, shipbuilding, and all of that is very, very loud. And these people now retire, and many of them have a hearing loss, a noise-induced hearing loss, and they sue their employers from then, and they usually win, because people didn't take much notice of the then already existing noise allowable weekly dosage. These days they do, they have to, because they recognize how expensive that is. So the US Army, what was the number? They pay $1 billion a year for noise-induced hearing loss. Soldiers coming back from Afghanistan, Iraq, virtually all suffer from some kind of hearing problem. Tinnitus, or noise-induced hearing loss because of obviously impact noises. And the US Army pays for it, and that becomes more and more. 100 years ago, nobody gave a damn. They just got home and became deaf. These days, people do care. Somebody waved their arm so that we can see something again. I can't move because I've got my... Yeah? It's a noise-induced hearing loss at 4 kilohertz, yes. Why is that specifically an issue? Hang on, I'll try to switch on the light. That's good, eh? Sorry, can you repeat the question? Yes. Why is the main noise-reduced hearing loss at 4 kilohertz? Where's this famous dip at 4 kilohertz coming from? Any answers? You should answer that yourself by now. What is the specific thing at 4 kilohertz? Remember last week's lecture? What is the resonance frequency? It's the resonance frequency of the ear canal. That's right, 3.5 to 4 kilohertz. So this is where the maximum energy comes through. Because there's a resonance, means it's a passive amplification of the sound. So you get the whole energy at 4 kilohertz onto the basilar membrane. The threshold, I'm talking about the threshold, yeah? The threshold is best at 4 kilohertz. I hope you recognize this figure. This is the threshold curve of a human in SPL. So we've got here about 100 hertz, we've got here about 4 kilohertz, we've got here about 10 kilohertz. So at 4 kilohertz we've got the resonance of the ear canal, which means you have the lowest threshold, usually around -5 decibel. But that means that is purely a function of the outer ear and the middle ear. It's nothing to do with the basilar membrane. The basilar membrane has the same responsiveness everywhere, but here most of the energy comes through because it's a lower threshold. There's lower threshold because it has the resonances here. So at 4 kilohertz you just have by far the most noise exposure, and that's why most of the hearing loss happens at around 4 kilohertz. There's a famous dip. I've never actually read a paper that confirmed that, but people told me that it's true, that if you measure the 80s, 90s generation that grew up with Walkman, that a lot of them have a 4 kilohertz dip because of the headphones that they were wearing, me including all of their childhood. Yeah, so what that results in, all of this, is... Oh yeah, what I wanted to say, the take-home message: if you can't get a job as audiologist, become an expert witness for court cases in hearing loss, and you can get rich in no time. There's a real opportunity at the moment to learn something. You need to be an audiologist, obviously, understand noise-induced hearing loss, and you can become rich very quickly if you feel so inclined. Right, this is what the result of the noise-induced hearing loss is, namely typical high-frequency sloping hearing loss. It affects, this is the 4 kilohertz dip that we already talked about. It affects all the 4 kilohertz, 8 kilohertz here specifically very much, and the 250, 500 not so much. Because they're at the apex of the basilar membrane, but the energy has to travel through there, so it's filtered quite a lot by that time. So the energy is mostly doing its damage at the high frequencies, not so much at the low frequencies. Okay, oh yeah, you've got the figure here. Should have shown that earlier. That's what a cat looks like that was noise induced. This is the healthy cat. 3 rows of outer hair cells, 1 row of inner hair cells. Beautiful. You see how fantastically structured these are. They're actually theories. I don't know if they're true or not. That the structure actually plays a major role, so that there are standing waves here in either direction. It looks like a what's it called in English? A lattice. So you've got a lot of higher modes of energy because of the geometrical structure of the outer hair cells. I'm not sure that's true though, but it's beautiful. Not so beautiful anymore after noise damage. Not quite sure what the noise was here, but it was quite a lot for quite a long time. And you see that the 3 rows of outer hair cells are practically not existing anymore. We've got some individual ones, but you see that these have been so much damaged that they are not repairing. They're just killed. They're just died, and they will never reappear. Whereas the inner hair cells, these guys are fairly all right. Some of them are dead, but most of them have survived. Yeah. So, what would this cat hear? It would hear a lot, just with a higher threshold, and reduced frequency selectivity. Okay. Here comes my schematic plot, how hearing loss, well, sensorineural hearing loss works. Here's our tectorial membrane, 1 inner, 3 outer hair cells, and this is the normal one. That's the normal threshold at 1 frequency. Say 1 kilohertz, this is the filter that this cochlea, this inner hair cell produces. If I lose the outer hair cells, the frequency response looks more like the red line here. So we shift it upwards by about 40-50 decibel, and it becomes much wider. Yeah, wider at as opposed to this tail here at the bottom. This is where we actually get our frequency selectivity from. We haven't got that here anymore. Now, if we had an inner hair cell sensory loss, we lose inner hair cells, but not the outer hair cell. Or we have a conductive hearing loss, which is pretty much the same. You don't lose all of the inner hair cells, but some of them. What would happen to the frequency curve, to the response curve? It'll look like that. It just shifts upwards because we have less of the inner hair cells that actually pick up the sound. But it has, because the outer hair cells are working, we have still the same selectivity. So if this is the result of a conductive loss, we can treat it very easily because we just need to amplify the sound and everything is good. In real life, well, in non-conductive cases, I don't think this is very frequent. I think there's only some very rare genetic damages that can produce something like that. This is not the result of a natural occurring phenomenon. What we usually have is a mixed loss. We lose some of the outer hair cells, a few of the inner hair cells, and then the response curves look a little bit like a mixture of that, so they become much wider. We might have a little bit of a tail there, and the thing is quite a mixture. Okay, that brings me to autoacoustic emissions. We talked about them earlier. There will be a practical for you where you learn all of that. You have heard it here already. So, repeating from what I said earlier, ears can produce sound. 50% of normal ears, if you put a microphone in there, will produce a sound. They're recently discovered, well, 78, by Kemp here in London. One of the things that should get a Nobel Prize probably, hasn't got so far at least. They're only in the good ears, so that's why they're useful for diagnosis, for screening, and clinically important because of the non-invasiveness and don't need cooperation. Why is it important? What's the main application for autoacoustic emissions? Well, one of them, newborn hearing screening. So if you had a child, anybody here had a child? No? Yeah. I don't know, Saudi Arabia? Do they do that there? Come in at... Yeah, day 1 after the birth. Somebody comes into a hospital and sticks something into the ear of your newborn. You think, oh my god. But it doesn't hurt, nothing happens. And screening means you can detect cases where it's probably, or where it's likely to go wrong. The point is, if you hear an autoacoustic emission, you're pretty sure that the hearing is alright. If you don't hear it, you have a higher chance that it is wrong. But it doesn't mean that it's because it's only in 50% of the cases, so you still have a high chance that your child is hearing well. But it has, in the UK, can't remember the exact numbers, it has led to tens of thousands of babies being diagnosed very early on with a hearing disorder, which means you can give them a hearing aid at the age of months rather than years, which means you enable them to have a completely or a much more normal hearing development. because, as you know, all the important time for hearing is the first 3 years of your life. When you learn language, or specifically when you learn language, and if you have hearing impairment for specifically the first 3 years of your life, you're screwed. It doesn't help that much later on to have the hearing aid. You need it very, very early on. Right. You can measure the autoacoustics emissions in response to clicks. They're called the transient autoacoustic emissions, or to pure tones. Then usually two. I can't remember the exact frequencies. Say again? 2 kilohertz. Yeah. And what's the second frequency? It's close by, because what you want to measure is the distortion product between the two. Haven't? Yeah. Say again? 2 to 4? 224. That's the one. That's right. That I won't remember. The point is why you use two frequencies. As I said earlier, you've got a nonlinear interaction, and the point is if you have two frequencies in there. I make an example. It's not the realistic one. If you say you have 1000 hertz in there and 1100 hertz in there, then you produce a combination tones, nonlinear combinations tones, which is most loud at the difference between these two, so at 100 hertz. So this is what you heard from the two tones going up. You heard the combination tone, which is the difference between the two, which is obviously going down because the difference went to 0. You can also have spontaneous autoacoustic emission. They originate in the cochlea. We talked about that. Between 500 to 2500 hertz, produced by the outer hair cells amplifier. They're characteristic per person. In fact, it has been suggested to use them for person identification, and that's not a stupid idea, because they're as individual as fingerprints. So if you haven't got access to fingerprints, or I don't know for what reason, you can measure somebody's autoacoustic emissions because they don't change very much in a reasonable amount of time, and they're very characteristics. They grow by 3 dB per 10 dB input level, so nonlinear can be used to distinguish from middle ear response. They grow very nonlinearly, again, obviously because they're a result of the cochlear amplifier. And talked about the frequency responses already. They're caused by the non-stable feedback by the outer hair cells. Okay. Last thing here, I want to talk about dead regions, because that's something that becomes more and more important in clinical practice. When the part of the inner hair cells are damaged or destroyed, you can have a whole area where there is no inner hair cell left. That's a dead region. Dead region because this area will not produce any responses. Now you would expect that you don't hear any of the frequencies in that area, but that obviously isn't the case. You don't have a blind spot ever on the cochlea. Yeah, because there's always, well, why? Because the filters are not infinitely narrow, the filters are always broad. So you can always listen with something which is called off-frequency listening, like this one. Let's say we have the grey area. Can you see that down there? Yes, the grey area is the dead region. And if you have, let's say in an optimal, in a healthy cochlea, you would have a response curve like that. Response of the basal membrane to a pure tone. We know now that this would be a little bit steeper, but this is just schematic. But if you have a dead region, all of this is gone, but you still have the response of the basilar membrane over here. So if you want to listen to this frequency, here you would have a fantastic response at this point. Here you don't have a hair cell anymore because it's dead. But you still have a hair cell here, and this hair cell picks up this sound. So you always have, no matter how large your dead region is, well, within reason, you will have hair cells at the edge of this dead region that pick up something. So you will hear something. And I put that in because you will have a practical on that as well, which probably explained in a lot more detail. That's called the TEN test, tone in noise test. Can't remember what the E stands for. The point of that being that you can find out if somebody has one of these dead regions by exactly using this off-frequency listening effect with adding noise. So if you measure a normal in quite a normal person, you say at 1,500 hertz. This is response curve. You would measure, for example, 18 decibel threshold in quiet. If you put noise on that, say 60 decibel noise, you would about need a 60 decibel tone. So if the sound and the tone, the tone that you want to hear and the noise is about the same level, you know you were listening on frequency. That means you don't have a dead region there. But if you are impaired or you have an actual dead region here, and you listen to a sound at 1,500 hertz, you listen to with actual this hair cell here at 1,000 hertz, and you might get a higher threshold, but you can't deduce anything from the threshold because from this point, because you could have a number of reasons. Because you might just have a conductive hearing loss or a sensorineural hearing loss, which increases the threshold. What you need to know is that you're listening off frequency, not on frequency. You do that by putting the same noise again on there, say here, 60, 70 decibel, and then you actually get 97 decibel. So you need 30 decibel more to detect the sound in the noise than you would do in the normal case. This is a gap. So the gap between noise and tone, that tells you there is a dead region, that you're actually doing off-frequency listening rather than on-frequency listening. Okay, number of concepts that we'll talk about or you discover later on in the practicals. That was the lecture. For Friday, Daniel had a something psychophysically that we've postponed now. What I want you to do instead is to do an actual little essay, maybe 2 pages or so, and I want you to describe how the active processes on the basilar membrane work with a few little figures in your own words, please. And we talk about that on Friday. So we'll repeat on Friday all of the active processes of this that we talked about in this lecture, but I want you to go and ask yourself a few of these questions. Go and try to read some books or get some books. Who here has the Brian Moore Cochlear Hearing Loss or the Psychology of Hearing? Yes, have a look into that, because that chapter on the auditory filters is worth gold. That's really, really good. And summarize that in your own words, how the active processes work, and maybe ask yourself the question, what happens if the active process go wrong, and what kind of hearing aid do we expect to have then? What's the name of the chapter? The name of the book, Brian Moore, Psychology of Hearing. I'm sure I mentioned that in the first lecture. This is the main textbook for this whole lecture series. If you have a look in the library, there are a number of them, but this is for you as masters in audiology. This is a good book to have in your bookcase. Promise. Okay. You have any questions immediately?